Hi there, I'm John Fish, and, well, for a college student, I read a lot of books. I read about a book a week. And I've talked about this before on the channel and the benefits that it brings, but every time I do talk about it, people ask me one question all the time, and that is, how do I remember what I read? So in today's video, my goal is to share with you 3 strategies that I use to help me remember what I read. And they vary from very simple strategies to slightly more complex ones. Before we dive into it, I'd just like to thank Audible for sponsoring this video. So the first, and in my opinion, the most obvious and necessary strategy for recalling and remembering what you read is just to read with a pen in your hand, taking notes as you go. So for me, I buy a lot of my books. I'll get them at secondhand stores, I'll order them at Amazon, whatever. So I'll write in the margins and I'll underline, and I have a lot of friends that will use highlighters. I personally prefer pens. Some people use pencils, whatever works for you. If you're, someone that uses library books or digital books, you can always use sticky notes, or you can highlight using, Kindle features or whatever the case may be. The key is to, as you're going, just note which passages are important. What stands out to you? Which are the most important ideas? And also, what I find is really useful is, how do these ideas connect to things that you've previously read or thought about? So how can you synthesize these ideas? So, for example, when I'm reading a book, oftentimes in the bottom of a page with an important concept, I'll say, okay, how does this relate to this other concept that I was reading about before? And then that just gets me thinking about the connections, which is a really good way to remember things. By connecting what you're reading to what you already know, it helps your brain kind of map out the totality of the information that you're taking in. And that's really useful. So, very simple strategy. Just while you're reading, have a pen, a pencil, and take notes in the margins, underline, write on sticky notes, write on paper, write on cue cards, whatever works for you. Take notes while you're reading. Trust me, it'll help you tremendously. It'll slow you down a bit, but it'll help you a lot. So strategy number 2 is actually a technique that I use for my schoolwork, and it was invented, or at least popularized, by Richard Feynman, although it really follows a general train of thought that a lot of philosophers have had. But the basic idea is that while you're reading, if you see, a chapter heading, or that you're about to read a passage about a certain idea, take a moment to just stop and, in most simple terms, Feynman says, as if you're talking to an 8-year-old, describe what you already know or what you already think on the topic. So for example, if you're reading a chapter about general relativity, write out what you already know, write out your assumptions, and also identify the gaps in your knowledge. And that's the key point here. Figure out where your gaps are before you read, so that while you're reading, you can fill in those gaps. And then after reading, what you do is you just do exactly the same thing. You pretend like you're talking to an 8-year-old, just talk to yourself. You can write it out if you want. And figure out if you still have any gaps. See if the gaps have been filled, or if there's anything that's still unclear to you. And if there is, then you just go back to the source material again until you're able to cohesively explain this idea to an 8-year-old. So I use this all the time for school, right? It's incredibly useful and very efficient. But you can also use it in pretty much any nonfiction book. It's a little harder with fiction, obviously, because you're looking at slightly more nuanced ideas that won't be broken up into chapters as easily. You might be able to still apply it, but for nonfiction reading especially, this is a bit of a no-brainer. So look up the Fineman Technique. There's lots of really great stuff out there on YouTube and on the internet, but it's a very effective technique for nonfiction learning. All right, so the final strategy that I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from my buddy, Zach Honovar, who is an immensely creative and well-read guy. He's working out in California right now, working with Yes Theory and some other creators. Really cool guy. But he posted an Instagram story a little while back talking about how he retains what he reads. And he had this very interesting system. So the strategy basically works like this. When you're reading your book, you take notes like I recommended in strategy number 1. You underline important passages, important ideas, and when you're doing that, what I recommend doing is just putting a little asterisk or maybe a sticky note on the page, because at the end, when you've written all of these notes, you're just going to go through and find the important ones. And on a cue card, just write out the idea. In your own terms, summarize the idea, give it a title and reference to the source material. Put it on a cue card and then alphabetize it. Okay, so what you're doing over time is you're building a collection of these important ideas from all the various books that you've read. So later on, you can just dedicate some time to going through these cards and remembering the ideas. And what this is really useful for, in my opinion, and granted, I only started doing this a few weeks ago, so it's relatively new to me, but what I've had tremendous success with for this is synthesizing ideas across books. Right? So going through these cards and thinking about an idea and saying, okay, well, how does William Cronin apply here? Or how does, Steven Pinker apply here, right? And figuring out these little connections, again, allows your brain to build this more cohesive model of the information that you're taking in. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do, right? That is how you remember things, is by building effective mental models. All right, so that brings me to the end of the third and the final strategy that I wanted to talk about. But I want to say that just diving into books, even if you don't want to apply any of these strategies right away, is tremendously beneficial. There's a really great quote that I want to share with you from Ralph Waldo Emerson. I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm going to read it off here. "I cannot remember the books I've read any more than the meals I've eaten. Even so, they have made me." And I think this is a really interesting mindset because, sure, it's useful to remember terms and to be able to synthesize ideas, but in a sense, your brain is already doing that subconsciously as long as you're actively reading and actively throwing yourself into these books, right? The worst thing to do is to get caught in this kind of like decision paralysis, like, oh, I can't start reading unless I have a pen and cue cards and whatever present. No, that's not the point. The point is to engage with this content and to expose yourself to new ideas and to new ways of using language and to just new ways of thought in general. That's the real power of reading. And that's what I found to be transformative in spending time to dive into these works. So I highly recommend it to you that you start to dive into books if you haven't already. If you have started to dive in, maybe think about applying some of these strategies so that you get more value out of what you're reading, particularly if you're reading a lot of nonfiction. All right, so that brings me to thanking the sponsor of this video, Audible. So I use Audible a lot in my everyday life to listen to fictional books. It's a great way to kind of dive into these amazing stories while you're walking, while you're on public transit, while you're doing chores, whatever the case may be. There are tons of use cases, and I love Audible for it. And when it comes to audiobook content, Audible is really the industry leader. They're unmatched. They have the largest collection of audiobooks in the world. And if you want to get your hands on one of any number of their collection for free, you can go to audible.com/johnfish or text the code JOHNFISH to 500-500. And what you're going to get is a 30-day free trial with one free audiobook from any one of their vast collection, as well as 2 free Audible originals. So I have an Audible subscription, and this past month I used my credit to listen to Emma by Jane Austen. It's a beautiful adaptation of this, very interestingly dramatized, and it's just very entertaining, and I definitely recommend the listen. So if you're looking for kind of a classic, but a fantastic classic, and a beautiful modern rendition of it, I highly recommend it. So again, if you want to get your hands on a free audiobook from any one of their huge, biggest in the world collection, as well as 2 free Audible originals with your 30-day free trial, go to audible.com/johnfish or text code JOHNFISH to 500-500. I highly recommend Audible. I use it almost every day. So thank you so much for watching this video. I'm John Fish, and I will see you next time.